It's lovely to be here with you. If you're haven't been around a while, I've not been here for a bit. So my name's Tim. I'm one of the leaders of the Woodlands Group of Churches. I live just down the road, just off Seymour's Lane, so I feel quite local. And it's lovely to be here with you this morning. And we're just finishing off our January series looking at prayer. So if you've been here the last three Sundays, we've been looking at kind of prayer power. How does prayer work? And we've spent more looking at praise. How is it appropriate for us in life when we communicate with God that thanksgiving, that honour, that worship of who God is and what God does. We then looked at confession. When we make mistakes, when we get things that are wrong, when we do things that hurt one another and also hurt God, how do we restore that relationship with God? And we looked at one of the prayers of King David, again, about him giving a model of what it is for us to confess when we've made mistakes, done things that are wrong, and how we can know the grace and the mercy and the reconciliation of God in our life. And I think last week was looking at a petition, which is probably all our favourite kind of prayer, of how do we ask God for stuff? How do we say, God, we want you to come, and there's this challenge, there's this problem, will you come and answer this prayer? And we looked last week at petition of asking, requests to God. So just to wrap up this series, we're looking this morning at a prayer of longing. What does it mean to have prayers of longing? Now you might think, I thought it was going to be about fasting. Well, it is going to be about fasting. But before we get there, it's about longing. Actually, I'm not sure when you pray. There's sometimes where you want to say, thank you, God. Actually, there's sometimes when you want to say, sorry, God. There's sometimes when you want to say, please, God. But there's sometimes where you know who God is and what he's like. You know his kind of story. And yet we live in a world where it's just not going how we kind of hoped. Well, actually, not just how we hoped, it's kind of not going how maybe God hoped. The kind of world that we're living in, there's not quite the love and the compassion and the tenderness, that the presence of God isn't so evidently around, but that people aren't encountering him like they should do. And somehow there's this kind of longing in our heart, a longing in our heart for more. There's a longing in our heart for who God is and what God does. And sometimes when we come to pray, we don't come to pray with a please or a thank you or a sorry. We come to pray with a, God, there must be something. There must be more. I read about what you did in the Bible, Jesus, and I look at the world now, and there's this kind of groan on the inside. Like all creation's groaning, waiting for the children of God to be revealed. And somehow that is part of prayer. That's part of prayer. How do we see the world as it is and know who God is? And somehow we're longing. We're longing for more. We're longing for the presence of God. We're longing for the power of God. And somehow maybe we can't articulate those prayers. And there's two things that God gives us, I think, to help with that sense of longing. One is the gift of praying in tongues, where we don't quite know what to pray, but we just know that we need the Spirit's activity. And he gives us the gift of tongues to help us to pray when our heads can't engage with the issues, and somehow just our spirit groans and calls out to God. But the second kind of thing that helps us in this sense of longing is fasting. And how fasting helps us to engage with the longings of our heart and the purposes of God. So that's where we're going to hope to go a little bit this morning. And it's not just about, your roast dinner when you get home in the bin. It's actually, there's something bigger around the whole, what we call spiritual discipline of fasting, that's around it's not yet how God intended it to be. And so how do we engage with that both personally, in the community, nationally and globally? So we've been looking at, so far, three prayers of King David. David was a king of Israel, lived about kind of over 3,000 years ago, was somebody who, as you read through the story of the Old Testament, was one of the heroes. In fact, Jesus himself is quite often referred to as the son of David, because there was something about about David. David's love and obedience, David's heart for God, being a friend, understanding something of God's ways, and a king that led, not without failing, as we saw last week. But there's something about David that we've looked at his prayers, and the prayer we're going to look at now is linked to the incident around the confession 2 weeks ago. And if you're here then, it was this kind of tragic story of David and how he should have been out kind of with the battles, seeing God's kingdom coming. And he stood at home and he saw this woman having a bath and committed adultery and killed her husband. And as a consequence, he, in disobeying God, for one reason or another, it was at least 9 months before he came to his senses, because he hadn't repented until Nathan, the prophet, came along and said to him, look, what you've done is wrong, and suddenly he's cut to the heart. But at that point, the baby's been born, so it's at least 9 months. We know our biology homework. So at least 9 months, maybe a year, without having repented and turned back to God. So we pick up the story of how Nathan has kind of pointed the finger, and this is what it says. And it says that after Nathan had got home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and it became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the 7th day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child had died, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized that the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions and changed his clothes, he went to the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request, they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, why are you acting in this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that the child is dead, now the child is dead, you get up and eat. He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he's died, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Okay, Tim, how do you handle a story like that? It's interesting, across the congregations we're preaching on this same passage, and on the 4th Sunday of the month down at Woodlands in the evening service, one of the young adults gets to preach. And so the person who's preaching tonight kind of said, I'm not going to preach on that passage. And he was kind of appalled. So can I not talk about Jesus? And so he's going to talk about Jesus, which is great. And you think, but why the deal? And I suppose he had 2 issues with this passage. The first issue is, if you're going to talk, he's quite kind of black and white, and he thinks that, and loves success. So if we're talking about fasting, we want to talk about fasting that works. And here, he fasts, and the child dies. I'm not sure if I want to be teaching on something from the Bible that appears to be a failure, because we're all for triumphant Christian living. We're all about for living the good life, and that's a deal, isn't it? Okay, we're talking about fasting, and you're talking about fasting, and the punchline is, don't, the child dies. I suppose the second thing is, the child dies. The child dies, and it seems to be at the beginning, it's God who seems to be punishing David for his sin by sending a disease and illness to this child, and this child dies not because maybe because it's God's divine punishment. And again, we kind of struggle. Is that kind of the Lord struck the child with and he became ill? How do we handle that? I mean, we've just become grandparents. Oh yes, we have. And you think, okay, 2 weeks ago, little Phoebe Joy entered the world. And up in Liverpool, they have the state-of-the-art, all the stuff that you could possibly want when it comes to kind of prenatal care. And so the reality is, in the modern West, infant mortality is fairly low. I mean, there are tragic, unfortunate circumstances that do happen. But generally, we do live with the National Health Service with some great, superb care, and so children don't tend to die in childbirth or infancy. Actually, there are parts of the world today where actually there is quite high infant mortality. And 2,000 years ago, believe it or not, 3,000 years ago, there was no NHS. In David's time, there wasn't any medicine, there wasn't any stuff like that. Actually, in all likelihood, infant mortality was quite high. So, as people try to process that, actually, probably for them, it wasn't as much of a shock that a child dies as it is for us that a child dies. How do they process events that happen in their life? And probably they process things with looking through the eyes of the divine, that actually this has happened because of the gods. Or if you're in the Jewish faith, this happened because of God. And maybe they attribute things that happened just, in inverted commas, naturally, and they say that actually that is God. God struck this baby with illness. Now, again, it's probably how you understand and how you read Scripture. But I kind of wonder whether it wasn't direct vengeance of God on this poor, innocent child, but maybe actually it was one of those things. Infant mortality was low, that the child, it was kind of one of the things of nature, one of the things that happened. And actually, things happen to all of us. And it's not necessarily God's vengeance and judgment on you that we face our own personal tragedies, that we face our own personal struggles. And I wonder if it wasn't that it was a proactive action, but somehow this happened and they were attributing it to God. And in that wrestling of God, what are you going to do about this situation? There was this sense of longing in David's heart. I'm longing for God to do something. Whatever's happened here, whatever the cause, it shouldn't be like this. A child shouldn't die in infancy. And so he throws himself in God's direction and starts to pray. If you've got questions about the Old Testament and God, actually there is a great little book that Helen Painter, who's part of the 8 o'clock service down at Woodlands, she's from the Baptist Church, wrote God of Violence Yesterday, God of Love Today, ? Wrestling honestly with the Old Testament. And again, if those kind of questions of did God really kind of visit judgment on an innocent baby because of what David did, and some of the genocide and all those kind of things, that is quite a good book if you wrestle with those kind of questions. So, how do we take what David's prayer, that this thing that happened, whether it was directly God's judgment or whether it was in the way that life happened 3,000 years ago, that infant mortality, babies did get illnesses, there was no cure, you couldn't take them to the hospital. How are we going to deal with these kind of things? And I suppose it's in that sense of God bringing longing and God breaking in, and things should change. Things should not be like this. That David's response is, I'm going to fast. I'm going to fast and pray and call out to God, because who knows, there's something about the mercy in God's heart that he might come and make a difference where we are. So, actually, I'll just say, in the end, did fasting work? Okay, who thinks fasting worked in the end? Okay, who thinks the fasting end? Who doesn't think anything? Okay, actually, in the end, I think, because it is very striking, isn't it? It's very striking that as soon as the child dies, he gets up, dusts himself down, he goes in and worships God. Actually, in the end, he says that he has this kind of idea that the baby who's died, he isn't going to come back to me, but I know that one day I will go to be with him. Now, where did David hope to be when he died? Well, I'm sure his encounter and his love with God, he kind of knew that he was going to be with God. So in the end, he knew that child was safely with God. And there was something about fasting that somehow in the pain and the disappointment, in the tragedy that was facing him, somehow the fasting had helped him to encounter God. So when the prayer wasn't answered, his relationship with God was stronger. Actually, it had done something about this longing of brokenness that at the end, slightly shocking to his attendants, he has this strength of affirmation that he'll dust himself down. It's okay, because one day I'll see my baby again. I've entrusted him to God, and I could go into the house of the Lord and I can praise and worship. There was something about his knowledge and understanding of who God was. And in some ways, I think that's what fasting does. Fasting isn't necessarily about getting your prayers answered. Oh, I thought it was. I thought it was like an extra little bit of blackmail, kind of a little extra bit of pressure on God. I thought fasting was, I'll pray my prayers, not answered. I'll pray my prayers again, not answered. I'll pray a little longer, not answered. Oh, okay, God, I'm really serious. I'm going to give up food. I'm going to fast. Kind of hand behind the back, God. Kind of, this is really it. And sometimes we can feel that fasting is a bit like that. Fasting is just about putting a bit of extra pressure on God, just to show that I'm just that little bit more serious than I was last week. But fasting isn't that. Actually, fasting is more than that. Fasting is more than just putting a little bit of extra pressure on God. Fasting is a discipline that expresses something of longing. It's interesting that in this story, it kind of starts with fasting, ends up with feasting. As soon as the baby dies, he has this great meal. And you think, oh, that's not the great way to celebrate a baby's death, have a feast. But there is something about this longing for God. A longing for God that when God is not around, when the world isn't as it should be, there's this longing in our heart that fasting is an expression of that. But then when God is around, when God does break in, when we feel that actually God is doing things that we weren't expecting and his grace and his mercy are abounding to us, of course it's a time for feasting. And in our Christian discipleship, there's times for fasting, there's times for feasting. There's times for feasting when we just sense that God's here. When we see people become Christians, when we see kind of that breakthrough in people's lives, when we experience the love and compassion and tenderness of God through church fellowship, of course there's times for feasting. But in this fourth kind of prayer, this longing prayer, this longing for there is more that God has to do, there's more of God's grace that needs to break into my life, into the life of others, of course there's fasting prayer. I was chatting to some folk here because I'm kind of sure that I spoke about fasting here 2 or 3 years ago, but I've asked people and said, no, you haven't done, Tim. So I'm trusting that they're right and Mike, because when I talk about fasting, it's sometimes called a spiritual discipline. I love Wesley's kind of phrase, which is a means of grace. Sometimes we think about spiritual disciplines, and we think, hoo-ha, come on, it's discipline, and we've got to find kind of solitude, and we've got to find reading your Bible, praying your prayers, and come on, fast. And we think of kind of spiritual disciplines. Whereas Wesley has this idea of means of grace. He says, actually, there's something about God. He's good. He's merciful. He's gracious. There's something about in heavenly places with Jesus, there's treasure, there's goodness that's stored up there for us. And we live in a physical world where we don't see the spiritual things with our eyes. So how do we access the grace that's God's? And what is it? That there's these means of grace. There's these kind of things that we can do to get the stuff that we can't do. There's things that we can do to make space for the stuff that God wants to do. And he would say it's a bit like in the Welsh valleys. They are these strange little things called reservoirs. And they're hidden away in the mountains. A dam's been built and stored up water. And the water from those reservoirs is unseen. But there's a means by which you can turn your tap and you get water in your kitchen, in your bathroom. Because there's a means by which the water gets from the Welsh valleys through those pipeworks into your kitchen or bathroom. There's a means by which the hidden resources of Welsh water come to Bristol. Actually, there's a means by which the grace of God can come to your life. And actually, these means of grace are spiritual disciplines there. So reading your Bible isn't something that you should do as a Christian. Read your Bible. Read it a bit more. Read it a lot more. Actually, it's a means by which we get the grace of God. I read the Bible and I find out about who God is and his story and his life, and somehow I receive his grace. Prayer is a means of grace. As I pray, I find that God brings his grace. That worship and solitude and giving, all these things are means by which I can receive God's grace into my life. And in some ways, I think David understood. David understood that there was something about, at this point where he's facing the death of his child, that he needed something of the grace of God in his life. And the grace of God was more than just the answer to prayer. The grace of God was to change and transform who he was as a person. So how is fasting, this sense of longing, how does it kind of work out in our lives? Well, we might say, well, we're New Testament Christians. A kind of fasting smacks of religion. It smacks of kind of, that's what the that's with Jesus. Kind of we don't have to do this kind of stuff because it's love and peace and joy and hope, and we just kind of go with the flow. And but actually, for those of us here, and if you're a guest or a visitor, kind of you actually the deal is we're following Jesus. I mean that is the deal of what we're trying to do. We're trying to follow who Jesus is. What's wrong? He was a carpenter. I mean. He was a carpenter. He would have had muscles. Come on. Sorry, it's distracting, isn't it? I'll move on quickly. We follow Jesus. So what does Jesus have to say about fasting? Now, he doesn't say, well, let's do away with all the laws, do away with all these processes. Actually, he's somebody who does say, he talks about fasting. So he says, when you fast, not if you fast. If you happen to be those kind of super spiritual people who haven't got over religion yet, you can fast. If you happen to be kind of people that kind of you've got an alternative lifestyle, you can fast. He said, no, when you fast, there's a kind of assumption that this longing in our heart gets some expression through the way that we use our food. So when you fast, don't look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they're fasting. I tell you the truth, they receive their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. A bit like David did. David put on the lotions and got dressed. He looked like a king again. So it's not obvious to others that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Second time, John's disciples come up and say, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting and yours are not? Are you really are you really a rabbi? Are you really kind of religious? Because all these other religious guys do fasting and your guys aren't fasting. Come on, where's your credentials? And Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot. So long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. I think there's times in our life where Jesus is saying that we should fast. Okay, don't be religious about it and go around saying, ooh, I'm fasting. Oh, look at me. Oh, did you hear my tummy rumbling? Oh, it's because I'm fasting. Don't kind of big it up, but it should be part of your fasting. But the deal, as Jesus says, is that when the bridegroom's around, we feast. When the bridegroom's not around, we fast. Actually, they will. While the bridegroom's here, we can't help but feast because the kingdom of heaven's breaking in. With John the Baptist and the Old Testament law, there was that sense of longing. They were longing for something more. They were longing for the kingdom. And in that sense of longing, it's very appropriate for John's disciples because they were waiting for the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. It's appropriate for them to fast. Actually, it's appropriate for old Israel to fast because they were longing for the Messiah. When the Messiah has come, it's a time for feasting. And in our lives, there's times where we know the presence of God round about us, and there's times where we don't. And maybe if this morning you're here and you know there's a longing in your heart for something more. You can't quite put your finger on it. It's not as though there's a prayer to be answered. It's not as though you know there's a sin to be confessed. It's not as though you're not being grateful, but there's a longing in your heart. God, there's something more. Then maybe fasting is something for you to consider. Because fasting leads to feasting. What turns fasting to feasting? My northern accent here, E does. E does. E turns fasting to feasting. Jesus turns fasting to feasting. He's the one that turns this disquiet with life. Why is my child ill? Why is this happening? And this struggle, this longing for a world to be a different place, what turns that sense of longing to that sense of, actually, Jesus, you're with us. I'm encountering your mercy. I'm encountering your grace. And I wonder, just as we finish, whether there's something about the physicality of giving up food that reminds us that there's a hunger, there's a longing for something more. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you have ever tried fasting, but by about I don't know how long it takes you to start longing for food. Some people it's midday, sometimes it's 11 o'clock, that there's somehow our body starts longing. I want food. You maybe get a smell of some toast cooking downstairs and think, toast, marmalade, and the giving up of food, our physical body starts to long. Maybe we start to get a little bit, blood sugar level goes a bit down, we get a little bit grumpy, and we just realise, actually, I'm not the kind of person that I necessarily want to be. And fasting reminds us there's a longing. Fasting reminds us that our human physical body is not enough to achieve all that we want to achieve and to see what we want God to do. And so there's something about giving up food that reminds us that we need to depend on the grace of God. There's something about food that just the physicality of the way that our body feels, the way that we feel that reminds us actually there is this sense of, things aren't right in our world, and the now and the not yet of God's kingdom, that we're in the now where it's struggling, and so I'm fasting, I'm identifying with that, but I'm longing for the day of feasting when Jesus returns, and I'm beckoning him in. And as we make the space for fasting, it's not necessarily about getting a prayer answered. It's about that hunger, that encounter, making space, the physical longing for the presence of God. And I wonder whether, again, I'm not sure how you relate to food. I know for some people, actually, maybe you don't relate to food well, and maybe physical fasting of food may not be a sensible idea. Maybe if you've had some eating disorder troubles in the past, and you know that eating food is a deal that has a power of its own, it may be best for you to try and fast something else. It may be you've got a medical condition, and again, it's not sensible with diabetes, or if you're pregnant. I know there's medical conditions. It's not sensible to give up food. And maybe you could just limit your diet. You could change and just limit some of the things. There's times where I limit having sugar in my coffee. How can you drink coffee without sugar? But I do sometimes, because it reminds me that there's something about as I tasted it and go, ick, there's more of your kingdom, God, that tastes sweeter or whatever. So maybe you can choose how to limit. But for each one of us, as I finish, to say, maybe there's a space for you to fast, to give space for God. When Jesus talks about the three things in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about when you give to the needy, don't announce with trumpets. Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who pray standing on like the synagogues, seen by others. Your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. And the third thing is, when you fast, your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. Now, I don't know how many of you will regularly give. I mean, if you're part of the church here, I know many of you, there'll be a standing order, and once a month, money will regularly go out. I know for some of you, you'll join with the prayer meetings that we have because you think prayer is important. Of course I'll pray, and I'll pray privately, but actually I'll come to the monthly prayer meeting. But I wonder whether you do the same with fasting. Or do you reserve it for emergencies? Of course, there's an emergency you might give to an earthquake or a landslide or a tsunami. Of course, you might pray when there's trouble. And of course, you might fast when there's trouble. But Jesus is saying it's the discipline of giving, praying, fasting. Giving, praying, fasting. Actually, it should be part of our regularity. I mean, I put my personal discipline is to try on the first Monday of each month to fast. Not because I've got a great big issue I want to twist God's arm for, but because I know it's what Jesus says. I love Jesus. I want to follow him. To be hungry for God. I wonder if there's longing. As I come to close now, as we come to pray, I wonder if there's a longing in your heart. A longing for the more of God's kingdom. The now and the not yet, the brokenness of the world that we live in, the pain and disappointment that we face. Maybe that's the pain of unanswered prayer. And yet in it, is there a longing for God, a longing for his kingdom, a longing for his purposes? How do we respond to that? Well, maybe we could have a minute of fasting. Let's have a minute of fasting now, but maybe you need to choose. Actually, let's maybe this week, this month, maybe talk to your friends, talk at home group this week. Oh, how does this work for you? Maybe a discipline of fast, making space for God. Let's pray now. And if the worship group come back, and I just want to pray that there would be a hunger in our hearts for God, a hunger for his kingdom, a hunger for him to break in, that we don't get disappointed by life circumstances and point the finger at God and exclude him, but even in the pain and disappointment, there's that longing in our heart, that hungering after God. Maybe should we stand? Let's stand together, shall we, where we are. And as we stand, maybe in our own hearts to say, I'm somebody here this morning who's just a guest and a visitor, and I don't know much about this stuff, but I do long that life makes sense. I long for connection with people. Actually, maybe I long for connection with God, and you know that things aren't right. Well, maybe even now as we take the chance to pray, maybe you are longing for some breakthrough, and I think there'll be a prayer team towards the back, and if you'd like someone just to pray with you for you're longing for God, you want that. Maybe you're not longing for God, and you want to be longing for God. Even that first, maybe get someone to pray with you. Say, I want that longing. But Lord, we just say now, in these moments, we realise that you are the God of immense grace and mercy, stored up in heavenly places for us. Thank you there's means by which we can access your grace. And I pray for each one of us that we would have hearts that long for more, long for you. As our hungry stomachs long for food, I pray that our hungry souls would long for you. Amen.